Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia on Comcast Channel 66 and streaming live at fullercam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight in the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Catherine Gilmore Richardson and Dr. Jill Bowen, Commissioner of Philadelphia's Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. And Denise Clay Murray and I will discuss the big news. Campaign finance reports have come in for our mayoral candidates and other candidates as well. But tonight we'll discuss the mayoral candidates. And we'll do that in the second part of the show. But we're going to lead off here with our interview with Councilmember Catherine Gilmore. All right, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we're into council's spring session now. What are your major goals between now and the end of this session?
Sure. Well, I can't believe we are in the spring of 2023 already. But as we head into this new legislative session, my goals are to really focus on and build upon some of the issues that I have been most passionate about over the last several years, but particularly some of the issues that I've been working on and trying to get them finalized this term. Recognizing that once you introduce legislation in a term, it has to be finished and completed by the end of that term, which for us will be December of 2023. So I'll be focusing on some of those issues that I really care about, which is really improving quality of life issues and public safety in all of our neighborhoods across the city of Philadelphia, working to connect Philadelphians to families, supporting and sustaining career opportunities, not just jobs, and continuing to take a whole government approach to addressing climate change and environmental justice, and working on, sort of finalizing and seeing to the end of the road some of our legislation that has transparency and accountability in government. So one thing I want to talk about and mention, because this will be some of the legislation that I introduced, is last week I had the opportunity to join Council President Clark in his district, Superintendent Watlington, Ryan Boyer, who is the business manager for Labor's District Council, but also for the entire building trades. And they announced a new construction trades program for seniors at Strawberry Mansion High School. And, this is one issue that I've really been focused on. I'm introducing legislation in February around career and technical education, but also around the development of a career and technical education high school in the city of Philadelphia, which is one of the long-term goals that I have for us to really reestablish CTE programming and a whole school that simply focuses on CTE education and connecting young people to those career opportunities. The other thing that we'll be doing in the next week or two is unveiling the 2023 version of our apprenticeship guidebook, which showcases all the available apprenticeship programs and opportunities in the city of Philadelphia. And it has all of the contact information, where you can go to apply, when, how much you would get paid, what skills you need, whether they're soft skills or learned skills in order to be successful, and how much you would make when you get to the end of the road. And why is that important to me? Because we just passed legislation that will give a point preference to all CTE students that graduate and apply for a civil service job with the city of Philadelphia. And we recognize that we have a dearth of employees right now. We have a number of city employees who are eligible or will be eligible for retirement over the next couple of years. And so we're seeking to do all we can to get as many young people in that pipeline as well. And so I'll be focusing on those education issues, quality of life issues in our neighborhoods and in our communities, focusing on climate change and environmental justice as chair of Council's Committee on the Environment, and being sure that we continue to increase transparency and accountability in government. One last piece of legislation that I want to mention that's been a real heavy focus for me over the last couple of months, and we've actually had a study done to help us kind of work through this legislation, but it's to pass legislation that would improve our city's rainy day fund. And why is that important? because while we have a surplus in our city budget that we know has been augmented by the federal government, now is the time for us to make preparation for any future economic downturn in the city. If anything should happen, we should always be fully prepared so that we can continue to provide good quality service to our residents. And so we'll be having a hearing on that legislation in the next couple of weeks to change the way our rainy day fund is set up and to change the contributions to that fund. Lastly, I just want to mention two other things around our drug paraphernalia legislation that we're continuing to work on to address some of the nuisance businesses that have really been plaguing our communities. We've seen a proliferation of these businesses since the pandemic. And so we're going to continue to work on ensuring that that legislation is being properly implemented. And then finally, we're working with the Department of Human Services and PPD on the establishment of the last two community evening resource centers, formerly known as curfew centers, so that we have one center in every police division in the city of Philadelphia. And so the RFP just came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we know with that, by this summer, we'll have 6 community evening resource centers up and running across the city of Philadelphia. The latest RFP was for the East Division, which is the 24th, the 25th, and the 26th Police Division, and the Northeast Division. And I'll get those numbers for you for those divisions. But we'll have coverage in every single neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia by summer of 2023. And that was really, really important to me.
Right. So a lot of things going on, a lot of things specifically around children and youth.
Yeah.
So I'd like to shift a little bit. We're about to enter budget season in about a month or so. And one of the questions I've been asking council members, how do you manage all that information you get about the budget? When the books are printed, they're probably about 3 feet high, and there's usually multiple volumes of them. How do you take up that information? Do you just look at certain things? Do you try to get through as much as you can? How does that work for you?
So I will say I am so thankful and grateful for the experience of being a legislative aide in city council. I was a legislative aide for 5 years. And so what I do with the budget and what I've historically done, and this is sort of how I was trained to do it, and I've augmented obviously through COVID because we didn't get the budget books during COVID. And all the information is available online as well through the finance department. But what I try to do is I try to break it down department by department. And I literally will take the section of the budget binder for that specific department, and I will read, and I know it sounds like really boring, but I will read every single page of that department. One, to see how and what the breakdown is of class 100, 200, and that's all the different classes of how we pay personnel is 100. Materials, supplies, and services, contracting opportunities, all of that is broken down by different class. And so I look at each one of those classes, but I don't just look at the information they give us for that year. I go back 3 to 5 years and make a comparison of how it's changed over time. I'll go back and reread the transcript from the testimony from the hearing of the last year or 2, maybe 3 now because of COVID. And I really put all of that together in sort of building out a framework of what questions I may or may not have and or what specific changes I'll request for that particular department. Particularly because I think, and this is one area that I love to focus on, is around zero-based budgeting. We do have some departments that have participated in a participatory budget process, but I do think it'll be advantageous at some point to shift many of our city departments to a zero-based budgeting formula, which would require you to start from zero every single year and then build upon what the needs will be and the needs of the residents will be for that year. Instead of just starting with, okay, this is where we were last year, let's kind of, figure out where we need to be this year based off of what happened last year. Because if we know that something's not working for our residents, or if we need to increase service in a certain area, we should say, all right, well, we've heard based on feedback and or data that most residents are concerned about X, Y, and Z. So maybe for this department, we should figure out how we can sort of get to that particular goal and utilizing zero-based budgeting to do that. So what I try to do in the budget process is go through every single department in that way. Look at years past, look at where we are now, read every single line so that, because some things will stand out to you and you'll say, that doesn't quite make sense. And so those items, then I'll, put a tab in or I'll fold that page so I know to come back to that page. So that's what I try to do in the process. It is very tedious. I remember being in LA and even now in council, I take the budget binder books home with me because it's not enough time to read all of that information during the week. So literally during budget season, on the weekends and in the evenings, sometimes I take the books out and sit on the porch and do it because there's just so much information to go through. So that's how I kind of try to look at this process and be very methodical and strategic and looking at everything and not taking anything for granted because it could be one thing that you don't look at that may be exceedingly important. And I never want to be in that space and place. So that's how I approach the process. But I think overall, it's important for my colleagues and I in council to ensure that we are working to pass a budget that really prioritizes the needs of our communities, and that's all neighborhoods across the city of Philadelphia, really hone in and focus in on some of the more significant quality of life issues that we know are facing our communities, and ensure that we're fully funding real important priorities that make a difference for our neighborhoods and for our children. And so that will be the goal. And obviously we all have little areas that we focus on in the budget process. So, I'll definitely be focusing on workforce development, arts and culture, climate change, also focusing on the Office of Supportive Housing and how families are interfacing with the system at first point of contact. That's important to me as well because we've received a couple constituent cases like that over the year. And so just really trying to get in as much as we can through this process and be sure that we ultimately pass a timely budget at the end of this term and that we can send it to the Piker board.
Right. Now, the city has an unprecedented budget surplus right now from higher than expected tax receipts and the federal government COVID relief funds. How would you like to see that money used in this budget, and how much of it, if you have an idea, and that's a hard question to answer right now, but do you think now is a good time to be using a lot of that money? Should we be more careful about it? What do you think about that?
Well, as I stated, I have rainy day legislation that will ensure that we put, funds away to adequately prepare the city for any potential economic downturn. And we do that so that we can keep our credit rating high, so that we can continue to have a great borrowing ability to do all of our different projects, what we call capital projects, which are like brick and mortar projects across the city to upgrade our city facilities. I do think it's a good time to ensure that we are properly resourcing as many quality of life issues and some things that we are always not typically able to fund because we just don't have enough surplus. But I also think we really have to be mindful that in the out years of our city budget, like 3, 4, 5 years down the line, that we anticipate we won't have as much revenue as we have right now. And so I think we do have to be thoughtful in this process and not go on a spending spree simply because we have a large surplus, but be thoughtful about how we are preserving and preparing for the future, but also giving our residents good quality service now. And so we won't have the same federal infusion that we had at the beginning of this Biden administration again for quite some time. So we're not going to be able to depend on a federal surplus of money coming in like we have right now between all these different packages from, the infrastructure investment package and everything else that has happened since COVID. So I think we just have to be mindful of that as we move forward and ensure that we pass a budget that is thoughtful, prepares us for the future, that helps our residents now.
All right, I'd like to bring Denise here on Philadelphia.
Yes, thanks, Larry, and thank you, council member, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Denise.
You were talking a little bit about how we need to be mindful in terms of the city budget and what we're spending money on. over the last couple of years, one of the things that we've increased spending on is gun violence programs. And we're finding out now that maybe that money isn't being put to its best use. Has council talked about what it's going to kind of demand of the administration to get this straightened out?
And so like thank you for that question, Denise. And like you and many other folks, we all are receiving this information, much to our dismay, about how some of this revenue has been utilized. And I think it is incumbent upon us as stewards of our taxpayer dollars to ensure that we are looking through all of what has taken place over the last several years with the fine-tooth comb, because we certainly do not want to be in a space and place where, from a council perspective, we allocate the dollars, and then it's up to the administration to utilize the dollars in the way that we have intended. And we certainly don't want to be in a space and place where any of those funds, any of those dollars are mismanaged. So I know that that will be a central part of some of the sort of investigatory work that we do throughout the budget process over the next several months. In addition to that, I do think it's important, though, that we should not lose sight of the fact that we do need to continue to focus on gun violence prevention and intervention in the city of Philadelphia. We do still need to do that work. We just have to make sure that when it happens and when we are properly resourcing that work, that work is monitored and that we are checking on the data to see what the outcomes have been. And so because this all has just happened over the last year or two, I anticipate and look forward to receiving additional information from the administration since they administer those programs on the effectiveness of those programs. And I think that will help us to make better, more informed decisions as a part of this budget process.
Now, part of that whole program was supposed to include having people that can help these organizations best utilize this money, scale up programs that are successful, that kind of thing. Are you kind of disappointed that that's not what's been happening here?
Well, from the few cases, and I would say the couple cases that I've seen thus far, obviously, we never want to hear that any of those dollars were misused or mismanaged in any way. Because we do want to ensure that we can provide technical assistance to organizations that do need the opportunity to scale up and really improve upon and expand their programming options and availability across the city. So I don't want anyone to think that, everyone is just going to throw up their hands, because we're not. We're going to ensure that we are looking at all of this with a fine-tooth comb and ensuring that the residents that need the support around gun violence prevention and intervention do receive that support.
Now, whether we like it or not, this is an election year. You can't get around it as much as you would like to.
Yeah.
But particularly with city council at large races, and this is what's always fascinated me about them, you have 8 million people, in some cases literally, running for a set amount of seats. How did you manage to get through that traffic when you ran the first time? And as you look at re-election, do you see yourself having to change your strategy in?
Well, that's a great question. One thing I will say is that last time I did not know that I would be running initially. And so we really only have 14 weeks to really run the best campaign that we could to get our message out to as many Philadelphians as possible. And obviously, as in the last race, I think it was about 32 people when it was all said and done. And even now we see sort of that same amount of folks who are wanting to run for 5 seats. And I think it's incumbent upon everyone that's interested in doing this work to, one, understand the importance of this work. We cannot take any of this lightly. I do think in this moment, with all the recent transition we've had in council, that it is important to have members of council who understand how to navigate city government, to make it work for people where it's not working, to make it work for folks, and the parts that do work, to navigate that part to ensure that our residents are getting the best quality of service. But again, times have changed since 2019. When we were inaugurated in January of 2020, who knew that 2 months after being inaugurated that we would be faced with a pandemic and then civil unrest and everything that has taken place since January of 2020. And so obviously, if you are planning to run the same campaign of 2019, I don't think that's a very wise decision. And so my team and I are certainly looking at all of that, all of the state legislative changes that have impacted the election process here in the city of Philadelphia and across the Commonwealth. And we are taking all of that into consideration as we move ahead with being able to run the most robust campaign possible to ensure that Philadelphians know and understand our message and the work that we want to do and continue to do in city council. So for me, I'm not taking anything for granted. That means not one person, not one vote, not one place. I am taking nothing for granted. And I intend to work especially hard now until May 16 to get the job done. And so that's the goal. And that has always been the goal. And it will be difficult because obviously last time I was not working and I was solely running. This time, we have to carry out the business of the people of the city of Philadelphia and continue to run and do everything necessary to be successful. And I intend to do just that. And if I don't sleep again until May or June, that's all right.
Now, when you ran for election the first time, and I'm not sure if this was exactly your slogan, but you were basically moms get the job done. If there's a mom that's out there that wants to run for council, any advice?
Sure. I've learned a lot since being in elected public office. And one thing I've learned is that this work is not easy. It is 24 hours a day. It is 7 days a week. It never stops. And I love it. But you do have to be cognizant of that when you have children, and particularly when you have small children. And so what I try to do is ensure that I'm building in time for them. And so I pick them up every day from school, every single day. And if there are days that I may have to miss, then my husband or my sister will pick them up. But I try to leave some continuity in their lives, particularly because they're so young. And then I try to spend time with them, and or now, because my kids are getting just a little bit older than they were in 2019, I do take them out when I can, when appropriate. Not very often, but I do try to incorporate them in the work that I do and in the process. I will also say that you have to be kind to yourself and take a moment for yourself when you can. And one thing I did learn last time that I'm trying to incorporate this time is, instead of ordering out a lot of food because I'm not home, I do try to plan and meal prep a little better this time, so my kids are eating more vegetables this election season than they did in 2019. And that was one thing that I joked about with one of the other moms, Erin Santamore, on the trail last time. And she said, our kids will eat vegetables again. And I don't know why that stuck with me from 2019, because I was so, I think one night I was just upset that I didn't get a chance to cook before I left, and I had to order pizza again. And I was like, oh, that's so terrible. But I would say be sure that you're making time to meal prep and, have everything together for your children at home. And really just, again, be kind to yourself and know that not every day you're going to be at 120%, but you just get up and give it all you have and do it again the very next day. And one thing I will say that I'm very encouraged about is that I'm seeing more women who are running for office highlight the fact that they are moms. And that was something that was a little faux pas when I kind of first entered into the political scene. It was something you knew, but you didn't really talk about. But now I'm seeing more women highlight the fact that they are moms, because we know as moms that we are super women. We do as much as we can to get the job done, both at work, at home, and in all facets of our life. And I'm just glad that that's something that stuck and is going to continue to stick because that's who I am. I'm a mommy first.
Okay, thank you for giving us the time. And I'm going to send you back to Larry McGlynn, my co-host, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you, Denise. Councilmember, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your work.
All right. All right. We would like to thank Councilmember Catherine Gilmore Richardson for being with us, and we'd like to welcome Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So today was an interesting day in local politics. The campaign finance reports were due yesterday, had to be turned in by midnight, and we have a lot of information right now about where candidates stand. Now, one of the gauges by which we measure a candidate's ability to win the election is how much money they can raise. Unfortunately, that's part of the process. And while this report does not necessarily give you a perfect idea of what will happen, it gives you a snapshot as to where we are now in terms of support for certain candidates. Was there anything that you saw that stood out to you in this in these campaign reports?
Well, first of all, the next time we do a segment on campaign reports, we got to have like the OJs for the love of money playing in the background, because that's kind of what this boils down to. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me. One was that Alan Dom really wants to be mayor of Philadelphia. And the reason I say that is he put $5 million of his own money. That's 5 million. I couldn't even, if you put $5 million in front of me, I'd be like, Dad, that's a lot of money. But when you're a millionaire, like former Councilman Dom is, this is your petty cash. So he put $5 million of his own money into his campaign coffers this time around. And what made that interesting was the timing in which he did it. He did it so late that while the millionaire's exemption or the doubling rule, depending on who you're talking to about this, is now kicked in, he did it so late that his fellow candidates couldn't start doubling up money at the same time he has his $5 million in the bank. Another thing that stood out to me was a campaign outlay for policy advice that Rebecca Reinhardt gave to former Mayor John Street, who just happened to endorse her a couple of weeks ago. Now, I'm not saying that there's a quid pro quo or anything like that. It's just, I want to know, why are you giving this dude $22,000? And I'm sure there's a reason for it, but that just kind of stood out, especially in light of the endorsement.
And $22,000 is not pocket change. That's a nice amount of money.
No, I mean, I could probably pay off several bills with 22 grand.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the Alan Dom number, that was the first thing I saw, because and what I want to just be clear about, I've been going through this report since last night. I still haven't gotten through everything. So there's gonna be more stuff that we'll bring out next week that will say, oh, we found this in the meantime. So we just want to be clear on that. If there's something somebody's seen already that we haven't gotten to yet, then it's not because we're not looking, it's because there's just so much information to go through. But the Alan Dom thing was the number that jumped out at me right away. Mm-hmm. That's calculated for effect, right? You're going to get the story of this campaign finance report period is going to be the $5 million. That's the number one thing I think stands out. I agree with you that the Rebecca Reinhardt money for former Mayor John Street stands out to me. And then the other thing is, as I said, it's a snapshot, right? It gives us an idea of where candidates are kind of in the moment, and really not even the moment. It's kind of like a snapshot of where they were at the end of December, at the end of the year. So we don't exactly know what may have happened in the last month. They could have more money than this. I suspect some of them do. But just to give you an idea, and I'll start. Let me see if I have all this up here. We can just do cash on hand, right? The amount of money that the candidates have right at that moment when this report was due. So we have Councilmember Derek Green, who had $440,000. We have current state rep Almond Brown, who had. I'm looking at the one. There he is. Who didn't have much, but he's also kind of just getting started. So he had about $3,000, a little bit more than that. Sherelle Parker, former Majority Leader Sherelle Parker, had about $460,000 on hand. Former council member Helen Gim had over $1 million on hand.
And she was second only to Dom.
Right. Jeff Brown, grocery store magnate, about $470,000 on hand at the end of last year. Former city controller Rebecca Reinhardt, just over $1 million, just behind Helen Good by a little bit. Former council member Alan Dime, as we mentioned, has $5,040,000 at the end of that reporting period.
40,000 is just kind of adding insult to injury in a way.
Yes, yeah. And then former council member Maria Fiona Sanchez, about $500,000. So that's kind of gives you a snapshot of where we are at the moment. And one of the things I just want to say, though, I remember years ago, I used to work on campaigns, and this is a long time ago. And I remember speaking with a fundraising person, and she told me, even if you're independently wealthy, you still have to make the phone calls for the money. And I said, why? And she said, because it's another form of voter contact. You need to be talking to people. And you need to talk to the people who are influential, who are going to get donations from. This is very important part of the process. Even if we had publicly financed campaigns, you should still make phone calls like this, even though you're not asking for money. And that always stuck with me, because it is very important to. So when I see, Alan Dom puts $5 million of his own money in, if I'm on that campaign, I'm saying you're still making the phone calls, though. You're still doing this. It's really important that we do it.
Because it is, because I spoke to Patrick Christmas at the Committee of 70, because I'm working on a story that's looking at the millionaire's exemption and why it exists. And he said, the amount of money you have is nice, but if it doesn't have voters connected to it, it's just a lot of money. And the thing is, I'm not sure in the terms of the mayor's race that $5,040,000 to add insult to injury dollars is necessarily going to translate into votes. It's going to translate into a stellar petition operation. It's going to translate into stellar get out the vote. But if the ward leaders are at all like I remember them in all of the other campaigns I've covered, just because you've given money to people to hand out your sample ballot in their ward, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily not going to cut you off because someone gave them more money. Now, I don't know who's going to be giving out more money than Alan Dom or Jeff Brown, who I was surprised had so little money, because he's another person that triggered the millionaire's exemption. But I guess he didn't sell enough pork chops that day.
Well, it's going to be interesting. We're still a ways away from this being resolved. We're not going to. I think this is an interesting place where we're going to see kind of where things are. Petitions when they begin I think on Valentine's Day actually,
Right.
and they'll be due March 8th. And for those who don't know, the petition process is if you want to get on the ballot, you have to get a certain number of signatures depending on the office you're running for, from registered Democrats within the geographical area in which you're running. For mayor,
Right.
I believe it's 1,000 signatures from registered Democrats if you're running for the Democratic nomination. You want to get like 3,000. When I was working in politics, I ran the petition operation for a few years in Delaware County. And one of the things that we would do is say, get whatever you need. It says you need, get 3 times, because you can get kicked off the ballot if the signature's thrown out.
Oh yeah, because Daffy Duck will sign your petition.
That's right. And my suspicion is most of the mayoral candidates have been through this process before. But I would look at the city council candidates, specifically the first-time candidates. They're the ones who need to be extra careful because they haven't done it before, and they could make a mistake. And if you show up with 1,000 signatures and one of them is considered deficient in some way, well, you're off the ballot. That's it. So you need to be really careful about that. But again, it's an interesting place to be, to see where these funds are coming in. Again, we don't know what's happened over the last month necessarily for these candidates and fundraising in terms of fundraising. But one of the things that will give us a determination too is how many signatures they get on their petitions. We may not exactly know the exact number, because I think after the first 1,000, you say, okay, you're one on, unless there's a challenge, then you go in, the next one. So those kind of operations will be important. And then, when do you start seeing advertisements and, get out the vote operations and those kind of things? Probably not right away, except for Alan Dom and Jeff Brown, probably, right?
Yeah, during the Eagles game, on Sunday, I might have seen Alan Dom's ad at least 3 times. So, you can't soon you will not be able to get away from any of these people, because
That's right.
They will be coming at you with petitions, and then the whole voting process, then the whole, please vote for me process starts. And it's going to be interesting to see how they do, how they set up their petition drives. And I kind of needed to push back a little bit on something, Larry. Just because you have been an elected official does not mean you know what you're doing in terms of your petition drive. There have been more than a few people that have gotten kicked off the ballot for bad petitions, despite the fact that they're incumbents and they should know better.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. My point was just that mayoral candidates, you would think, might be in better shape.
But
who knows? That. You never know. Right. There's always someone. Somebody. It always happens to somebody. So we're going to see about that. So next week, when we have a little more time, over the next week to go through these reports, we'll find some information that we think is useful. And what we're going to do with them is, we'll talk a little bit more next week about them. What we'd like to do right now is play an interview we did with Jill Bowen, who is, and the reason this interview is important is because, they're all important. Whenever you have a member of the administration, that's important to hear what they have to say and what they're doing. But in this case, I think it's doubly important because she's going to tell us about the opioid dollars that the city is getting from the nationwide opioid fund and how that money specifically is going towards treatment. And that was something that Denise and I and Lance have been talking about for a while, about, well, how specifically are we going to do treatment with this? And Dr. Bowen came on and tell us a little bit about what the administration's thinking. So this is our interview with Dr. Jill Bowen. All right. Dr. Bowen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your department?
So, my name is Jill Bowen. I am a psychologist by training. You can tell from my accent that I didn't grow up in Philadelphia, but I have fallen in love with Philadelphia. I came from New York, where I did a lot of work in public health, behavioral health for many years, and also worked for the mayor's office and instituted a number of really interesting, innovative programs there. And through one of those programs, really learned what was happening in Philadelphia, which is why I felt really drawn here. Because the work that is going on in Philadelphia in behavioral health is phenomenal. I came as deputy commissioner, and during the pandemic, the former commissioner left, and I threw my hat in the ring and ultimately was appointed to commissioner. So it's been just 2 years that I've been commissioner. The department is the City of Philadelphia's Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disabilities Department. It is a large department made up of 7 divisions. And those divisions include administrative divisions and clinical divisions, and also have a unique relationship with community behavioral health, which is the city's behavioral health managed care organization, and the special relationship with being a part of GBHIDS as the managed care organization brings a lot to Philadelphia. Our mission, let me just say our mission is to serve the Philadelphians who are challenged with behavioral health issues and intellectual disabilities issues, but also to look at behavioral wellness for the population as a whole. And we do that through these many divisions and in partnership with many stakeholders throughout the community. My vision as commissioner that I brought is called TECH, which is addressing trauma, achieving equity and engaging community. And that is our lens by which we determine priorities. And we need to make sure that all of our initiatives align with that vision. We have a very robust strategic plan and are pretty innovative in our efforts to address some very complex issues in the city of Philadelphia that have a significant nexus with behavioral health.
So I'm gonna jump away from my prepared questions for 1 second. The framework you just discussed, the lens by which you look at the charges that come before you. Can you give me an example of how that works? And when we talk about, I don't think it's lost on anyone that equity is one of the major issues in the city right now. So in your work, how do you use that as a guidepost? And is there an example you can give us about that?
Yeah, so every initiative we ask ourselves regularly, is this aligning with those initiatives? In our strategic plan, we have it divided up by the different efforts that we're undergoing. And then we have, is this addressing trauma? Is it achieving equity? Is it engaging community? And then we look to determine, well, if it is, then we can measure together that it's having some effect in those areas. And we can also prioritize. If it's not, then it's not necessarily something we're going to put more resources into. So one, prioritizes for us. 2, helps us to determine how we can see the impact of it. And 3 is something that is absolutely critical if we're looking at population health and we're looking at behavioral wellness in addition to behavioral health, which is it's kind of the treatment component is the behavioral health, and the wellness is all of these social determinants of health, which of course impact treatment. And that is so critical. It's a really important part of the way in which we think about the work that we do, is that social determinants of health, we're talking about housing, economic opportunity, work opportunities, addressing homelessness, looking at just the full range of things like digital divides, when you're talking about telehealth, the food insecurity. All of these impact behavioral wellness. So for us not to prioritize around those issues and the disparities that have been here for centuries and decades, if we're talking about racism and structural racism, we're talking about centuries of trauma. If we're talking about poverty, we're talking about complex situations that have existed over many, many years that also got exacerbated by the pandemic. And so if you're not talking about disparities and inequities around behavioral health, you're going to miss your chance to really have the kind of impact that you need to have. The trauma is multi-layered. If you're talking about gun violence, or you're talking about substance use crises, or you're talking about the impact of the isolation of the pandemic, it's just layer upon layer of trauma. So we need to make sure that what we're doing in our systems approaches mitigates trauma, doesn't add trauma. So sometimes you might have a systemic response, let's say to a behavioral health crisis, where a person ends up, let's say, getting arrested. So we looked at our system and we're in the midst of a real transformation of behavioral health crisis system, so that our system shifts to one that is trauma mitigating, a community response, one that is non-coercive to the extent possible. So that's how we look at our initiatives. And is it trauma additive or trauma mitigating? And if it's trauma additive, we shift it. And we really look at what needs to happen from the approaches that we're taking to make them trauma mitigating, easing the trauma. People are already in distress. You don't want to add to that distress. You want to ease it. So that comes to everything from access, where there's inequity in access. It comes to opportunities, as we said, and social determinants. So this is, I hope that gives you more of an idea of how that framing impacts our decision-making and much of the transformational efforts and the systemic approaches that we take.
It's very interesting to hear you describe it in these terms. Often, I would think almost in every case, you're seeing people at a very difficult time in their lives. So to look at it as, well, we need to mitigate trauma and not cause more trauma. It feels like a lot of the work that you're doing with people, they've experienced significant trauma, and understanding that and making that part of your the way in which you look at all these issues makes, to me, that makes a lot of sense. I'm not an expert by any means, but it's good to hear that that's one of the focuses.
There's a certain intentionality that is absolutely necessary around this, so that it's a focus of attention. It's a deliberate focus of attention, which is different than just sort of assuming that it comes along with, because nothing really moves forward in a significant way without that level of intentionality.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to talk a little bit about the opioid settlement that the city has received. We know that the opioid problem is significant here in Philadelphia and other places across the country, but very pronounced here as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that settlement? We did have Noelle Foison on the program last week. She told us, gave us good detail, but from your point of view, what does the settlement look like?
Yeah, so the settlement is a multi-year, and to be clear, it's the settlement, the national settlement that has happened up until this point. There are other things in the midst, so that this might not be the only settlement that ultimately comes to us, but we don't know that for a fact. But we are hopeful, because the impact of the opioid crisis is so dramatic and so painful, and has been so hurtful in Philadelphia, that the resources being returned to Philadelphia are absolutely essential, and we really need them. there's been a tremendous, if you talk to Noel about the ORU, or the Opioid Response Unit, that grew out of the emergency response to look at the opioid crisis, it was a multi-agency effort, and this was a way to continue that work by sort of routinizing it into the administration structure. So we are obviously an important part of that group, but in our own right, we are working to try to address some of the really challenging issues in Kensington and the city as a whole around the opioid crisis. The settlement itself was the city of Philadelphia received somewhere around $20 million to try, and that's the first round of it. There's like 18 years of money that will flow, and it's different amounts each year. It's a whole structure in the settlement that was worked on with many lawyers and through Harrisburg. So the DBHIDS initiatives that I think would be helpful for me to talk about with you in this context is there's three major sort of treatment focused initiatives that are really important. And a lot of the sort of decision about what should be first, because there's more money to come, right? And comes from listening to those who are impacted by or most impacted. And we need to keep in mind also that the impacts are the individuals who are struggling with substance use, and those in communities that are impacted by the presence of substance use. And let's be clear that when people are struggling with substance use, there's also many who are also at the same time experiencing homelessness, and experiencing a number of those social determinants of health that we talk about that also impact. So we try to address this comprehensively. But those three initiatives that I'll share with you are the mobile methadone. Mobile methadone is something that we've talked about for a while. We've talked about it with the state. We've talked about it with the feds, because it needed to have some regulations shifted in order for us to be able to have such an entity on the ground. So we will be standing up Philadelphia's first mobile methadone van. And that initiative is meant to address one of the key issues, which is access. It's also meant to reduce things like any kind of waiting time, because it's same day induction with methadone. The van itself has like 3 sections on it. One where there's a place where there can be an assessment and counseling. One where there can be a physical examination and drug screening, and another where there's chances to have someone who's speaking with you, like actual counseling. So there's like sections on it. I mean, it's really designed very well to be kind of like a little clinic. And you can be induced there, as you said, with methadone same day. Why is methadone getting a resurgence? Part of the reason that methadone has been a focus of attention more recently is because of the fentanyl and because of the types of withdrawal that people on the street are going through. They have been asking more for methadone than, let's say, one of the other MATs like buprenorphine, because methadone makes that withdrawal a little bit more manageable. So it's really important that we have the resources out there that will help people who are on the street accept treatment, right? Be able to come in and accept treatment. The idea behind the mobile methadone obviously is access, but it's also to ultimately connect people to bricks and mortar treatment, to get them into more stable housing, to start to create the journey, which is our goal and the goal of those we serve. It's really long-term recovery. We're talking about whole person health. We're talking about long-term recovery as the real goal. And we understand that substance use takes a course that sometimes is up and down and up and down. but the real goal is long-term stable recovery. So that's the mobile methadone. Obviously, we're very excited about it. The wound care van and clinic is another really critical piece that was piloted during our 100-day challenge. It is the first licensed wound care van in the Commonwealth. And the idea behind that is that multiple physical health problems exist on the street for people who are using substances, and for the community who's observing that. But xylazine has contaminated further the drug supply. And that's not an opioid. It's mixed in, but it's not. It's actually a tranquilizer, an animal tranquilizer. So the effects on humans is pretty devastating, in terms of both the way in which one has to withdraw from xylazine, but the wounds that people get from ingesting the xylazine is horrific. And so that had been a barrier to access, and to rapid access, because the rehab programs require people to have some sort of physical stability in order for them to come in and begin their rehab. And the wounds themselves were so severe that they were barriers. So to get the wounds addressed as early as possible, and to get them cared for, makes for an easier access. The other thing I think that was really interesting during the pilot was that sometimes people don't want to talk to outreach workers who are looking to engage them and have them come in for treatment and housing. But they did want to get their wounds cared for. So by connecting the outreach workers with the wound care workers, some of the folks began talking with the outreach workers who might not have otherwise, and said, yes, now I do want to come in for treatment. So it helped with access, it helped to remove barriers, and it got people same day on to have their wounds cared for and be able to get into rehab programs more easily. The other place where it's not part of the opioid, but it is something important to talk about, is CBH and its support of 4.0 level ASAM, which is a level of care for rehab that includes addressing these kinds of physical healthcare wounds. So in addition to having a methadone and wound care on the ground, we are also looking to build that into our services that are available once people come in for rehab. The third is the MAT behind the walls. And why MAT behind the walls, which means in the jails, is so critically important is twofold. One, when people are in jail and come out and they haven't been receiving treatment, they're at a much greater risk of overdosing and dying, because they may go back to their same doses, but they haven't necessarily had that. When people have been in the jails, DBH-IDS has already over the years been supporting people who come in and are on methadone to be able to continue their methadone in the jails. But until this point now, what we're standing up is to be induced if you meet the criteria. Before that, that wasn't an option. And the other piece of the MAT behind the walls is the buprenorphine, which has a program currently in the jails, but not dosing at the level that people outside the jails. The therapeutic dose was really too low. So then what happens is not just do they come out and it's safer for them in terms of overdosing and death, but they come out already in treatment and are far less likely to go back out onto the streets. They go directly into ongoing continuum.
All right. We would like to thank Dr. Jill Bowen for being with us on the program. The rest of that interview will be on our website and in our newsletter this Friday. Speaking of which, Denise, can you tell us what you're going to be talking about in this week's newsletter? You are muted.
What I'm going to be talking about is something that Hall Monitor is going to be sponsoring. And that is my husband Chris's coverage of the Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs playing in the Super Bowl. I'm just going to be, kind of letting everybody know that, yes, while we talk about a lot of serious stuff, we talk about fun stuff too.
All right. Next week on the program, we'll be joined by Council Member Kendra Brooks, City Commissioner Omar Sabir, and our own Lance Haver will be back with us talking about the water rate hike. We'd like to thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you next week.